The door was open. Edgar Fairchild stood on the bottom porch step of the Callahan property and stared at that open door like it was the mouth of something that could swallow him whole. His hat was in his hands, turning slow circles the way it always did when his nerves were working against him. The morning sun was barely cresting the red mesa to the east, painting the dust of Copperhead Creek, Arizona territory, in shades of amber and rust. It was the spring of 1882, and in all the weeks he had walked up this path, stepped onto these warped pine boards and stood before this very door, it had never once been open. He had never knocked. That was the truth he carried like a stone in his chest every single morning. He would come and he would stand, and something inside him would go absolutely still and terrified, and then he would leave. He would walk back down the path between the scrub brush and the tall, dry grass, mount his horse and ride back into town with his deputy's badge catching the morning light like an accusation. But this morning the door was open, not just cracked, wide open. The darkness of the hallway beyond the threshold breathed out at him, cool and waiting. A thin curtain shifted in the early breeze. From somewhere deep inside the house came the smell of coffee, dark and real and devastating, and Edgar Fairchild understood in the marrow of his bones that Elvira Callahan had left that door open for him specifically. It was an invitation. It was a verdict. It was the end of something and the furious, terrifying beginning of something else entirely. He stood there for a long moment, the desert wind moving through the tall grass around the fence posts, a mockingbird calling from somewhere in the cottonwood tree at the corner of the property. His jaw was tight. His heart was doing something catastrophic inside his chest. He was going to have to go back to the beginning to understand how in God's name he arrived at this moment, because nothing about Edgar Fairchild and Elvira Callahan had been simple. Nothing about the secrets between them, the dark past that hovered over this property like weather, the forbidden territory of what he felt when he looked at her. None of it had been simple. And the story of that open door did not begin on this morning. It began 7 weeks earlier, on the worst night Copperhead Creek had seen in a decade. It began with blood on the saloon floor and a woman standing over it who was not supposed to be there at all. Copperhead Creek was not a large town, but it had ambitions. It had a main street of packed dirt that turned to mud in the monsoon season and cracked into a mosaic of dry earth the rest of the year. It had a general store run by a man named Horace Dempsey, who was honest but cheerless. It had a church with a crooked steeple and a preacher who drank more than he prayed. It had the Silver Bell Saloon, which was the social center of the territory, whether the church liked it or not. And it had a sheriff's office with 2 cells, 1 sheriff and 1 deputy. The sheriff was a man named Ward Prout, who was 54 years old and had a knee that told him the weather before the clouds arrived. He was competent and fair, and he had hired Edgar Fairchild 3 years prior because Edgar was the only man who had applied for the job who did not seem to want it for the wrong reasons. Edgar was 28 now. He was tall, with dark hair that curled slightly at the ears when it needed cutting, and eyes that were an unusual shade of gray-green that women in town had opinions about. He was quiet in the way that some men were quiet because they were hollow, and other men were quiet because they were full. Edgar was the second kind. Elvira Callahan had arrived in Copperhead Creek 11 months before the night of the saloon floor. She had come by stagecoach from Tucson, which was itself not her origin. She was 26 years old, and she had brought with her a single large trunk, a sewing case, and a reputation she had left behind her somewhere east of everything. She had purchased the old Hargrove property on the edge of town with money that people speculated about, because speculation was the primary industry of small towns. She had set up a dressmaking business in the front room of the house and had been, as far as the town could observe, perfectly quiet and perfectly private. People tried to make friends with her. The women of the church auxiliary called on her twice. She was polite both times and did not call back. She accepted commissions for dresses and did beautiful work and charged fair prices. and she spoke to her customers warmly while they were being measured and fitted. And then she said goodbye with a kind of finality that let everyone know the relationship ended at the door. Edgar had noticed her the way a man notices something that should not concern him, but does anyway. He had first seen her at the general store, 3 days after her arrival, standing in front of the bolts of fabric that Horace Dempsey kept in a narrow alcove near the back. She was running her fingers along a length of deep blue cotton with the focused attention of someone who understood materials at a molecular level, and the concentration on her face was so complete, so unguarded, that he felt like he had seen something private. She was wearing a brown traveling dress that was clearly well made and carefully maintained. Her dark hair was pinned back practically. She was not what most men in Copperhead Creek would call a beauty in the conventional sense of the word. She was better than that. She had a face that held everything it was thinking just beneath the surface, like deep water, and Edgar, who had always been drawn to depth over shimmer, felt the pull of it immediately. He had been on his way out the door. He had kept going, but he had been aware of her presence in town from that moment forward with an awareness that was inconvenient and persistent. He knew when she opened her business. He knew because it was a small town and information moved like water through cracks, that she was skilled and solitary. He knew she walked to the well herself every morning rather than asking the Dempsey boy to deliver water. He knew she kept a garden on the south side of the house that, by midsummer, had produced more tomatoes than any single woman could eat. He had never spoken to her. The deputy's rounds took him past her property every morning because the Callahan place was at the eastern edge of his patrol, and he liked to begin his mornings heading into the sunrise. He had established this route before she arrived, and he had maintained it after, and the fact that he now slowed his horse when he passed her property was something he noted without doing anything about. Once, in October, he had seen her on the porch as he rode past, a cup in her hand, watching the morning. She had raised the cup slightly in acknowledgement. He had touched the brim of his hat. Neither of them had spoken, and somehow that had felt like a great deal. It was 2 weeks after that morning that Edgar Fairchild first walked up to her porch. He could not fully account for what moved him to do it. A widow 2 streets over had complained that someone had been helping themselves to vegetables from her kitchen garden at night, and Edgar had been making a point of checking fences on the edge of town more carefully. He had been on foot that morning rather than horseback, and he had come around the side of the Callahan property checking the fence line, and there she was in the garden, kneeling in the dirt with a trowel, pulling up the spent tomato plants for autumn. She looked up when she heard his boots on the path. Her expression was guarded but not unfriendly. "Deputy," she said. "Miss Callahan," he said. He stopped at the garden fence and held his hat in his hands. "Just checking the perimeter fences. Someone has been getting into Widow Marsh's garden." "I know," she said, returning to the spent plants. "It is raccoons. I have seen them. 3 of them, a mother and 2 young ones. They come in under the south corner of her fence." He stood there a moment. "I will let her know. She will want them trapped," Elvira said without looking up. "She strikes me as the type." "And you?" he asked before he could help it. "If they were coming into yours." She sat back on her heels and looked at him then, and there was something in her expression that was neither cold nor warm but was entirely honest. "I would leave them something better on the edge of the property," she said. "To keep them out of the main beds." He thought about that on his way back into town. He thought about it the next morning and the morning after that, and without fully making a decision about it, he began walking his morning patrol instead of riding it. He told himself it was for his health. He told himself it was the fence line. Both of these things were partially true and almost entirely false. He walked past her property every morning, and sometimes she was on the porch, and sometimes she was not, and on the mornings when she was, they would exchange a sentence or two. The weather. The condition of the road after a rain. A brief commentary on some piece of town news. These conversations lasted no more than 2 or 3 minutes each, and were characterized by a careful, mutual restraint that was itself a form of communication. They were both people who knew how to hold things back, and in recognizing that in each other, something passed between them that was more intimate than most conversations Edgar had in a day. He never walked up onto the porch. He stood at the foot of the steps or just beyond the fence. He never knocked on the door or indicated in any way that he wanted to be invited inside, because wanting something that much requires a courage that Edgar Fairchild, for all his visible composure, had to build up very slowly. And then came the night at the Silver Bell. It was a Tuesday evening in late March. Edgar was on late rounds, covering for Sheriff Prout, whose knee had swollen from a cold front. The Silver Bell was louder than usual, crowded with a group of cattlemen who had come through on the way north and who had been spending money with the efficient dedication of men who would be sleeping outdoors again by Thursday. Edgar had looked in at 9, found nothing more alarming than high spirits, and moved on. At 11:30, the shot that he heard from 2 blocks away changed the character of the night entirely. He ran. In 1882, in a town like Copperhead Creek, a shot at 11:30 in a saloon was not an announcement of celebration. He hit the doors of the Silver Bell at a run and found the room frozen in the particular suspension that follows violence. 2 men were on the floor. One of them was moving and swearing. One of them was not moving at all. And standing between them, with a small .32 caliber revolver still in her hand and her dress splattered with something dark, was Elvira Callahan. Edgar's entire professional training and a significant portion of his personal control was required in that moment. He took in the room in a single comprehensive sweep. He located the threat, which appeared to be neutralized. He identified the injured parties. He noted the position of the weapon. And then he looked at Elvira Callahan's face, and what he saw there was not what he expected. He expected fear or the aftermath of fear. He expected the particular hollowness of shock. Instead, he saw something cold and clear, like a woman who had made a calculation and was standing in the result of it. Her hand was steady. Her eyes were moving, still taking in the room, still assessing. She was not done thinking. She was still working. "Miss Callahan," he said, moving toward her slowly, keeping his hands visible, the way one did with someone who still had a loaded weapon. "I need you to lower the weapon." Her eyes found his. Something in her expression shifted, not relief exactly, but a recognition. "The one on the floor with the knife wound will live," she said. "The other one came in behind me." Edgar glanced at the man who was not moving. There was a great deal of blood. "I see that," he said carefully. "The weapon, Miss Callahan." She lowered it then, holding it out to him grip first, and he took it and she let go, and that transfer of the weapon was the most charged thing Edgar had experienced in 3 years of law enforcement. His fingers brushed her palm. He felt the warmth of the metal that had been in her grip. He understood in that moment, completely and irrevocably, that Elvira Callahan was a woman with a dark past, and that it did not diminish her in his eyes by a single degree. He held her in the saloon for an hour, taking her account and the accounts of the witnesses, while Sheriff Prout was roused from his bed and the bodies, one dead, one injured, were attended to. The dead man was identified as Cass Whitmore, a name that Edgar did not know, but that caused some of the older men in the room to exchange looks that he catalogued for later consideration. The injured man was a local, a ranch hand named Bundy, who had been sitting next to Elvira at the bar, where she had apparently gone to have a whiskey, which was unusual enough for a woman in 1882 to have attracted attention, and which had attracted the wrong kind. Elvira's account was concise and stated without embellishment. Whitmore had approached her, recognized her, said something to her that she declined to repeat for the official record, and had drawn a knife. She had drawn her revolver, which she carried in a pocket of her skirt, and fired once. Bundy had been struck by Whitmore in the confusion, which was why he was on the floor with a knife wound. Sheriff Prout accepted this account and ruled the shooting a justifiable act of self-defense, which it plainly was. Elvira was free to go. Edgar walked her home. He did not ask permission. She did not object. They walked the 3 blocks from the Silver Bell to the eastern edge of town in silence, and the silence was not comfortable or uncomfortable. It was necessary. There was too much to process for conversation, and they were both people who understood that. At the fence of her property she stopped and turned to face him. The moon was high and bright over the desert, and in its light her face was very still. "I am not going to ask you," he said. She waited. "About Cass Whitmore," he said. "About why he recognized you. About what he said. I am not going to ask because it is not the law's business unless you make it so, and you did not do anything wrong tonight." Something crossed her face that was too quick to name. "He was not the first man to look at me that way," she said, "but I have never killed one before tonight." "I know," Edgar said, and she looked at him sharply. "I mean," he said, "that I believe you." She studied him for a moment. Then she turned and went through the gate and up the path to her porch. At the door she stopped, but she did not turn around. "Thank you, deputy," she said. "Edgar," he said. He did not know where that came from. It was not like him. A pause. "Good night, Edgar," said Elvira Callahan, and she went inside. He stood at the fence for a long time after the door had closed. The desert was loud with night sounds. His heart was doing something it had no business doing. He walked past her property the next morning, as he always did. She was not on the porch. He stood at the foot of the steps for a moment anyway, longer than he usually lingered, and then he walked on. He told himself he was checking on her after the events of the previous night, which was entirely appropriate and professional. He told himself this several times. He came back the morning after that, and the morning after that. The visits had changed character. They were no longer casual intersections of his patrol and her morning routine. They were intentional, at least on his part, and he was increasingly certain they were intentional on hers as well, because she was on the porch on the mornings he came now in a way that suggested she was waiting, though she would never have admitted it and he would never have called it that. They talked more. About real things, slowly. The way 2 cautious people peel back layers of themselves only when they are certain the other person will not use what they find. He told her about growing up in Kansas, about his father who was a blacksmith, about coming west because the frontier had felt like the only place where a man could define himself by what he chose to do rather than what he had come from. She listened in a way that most people did not listen, fully and without preparing her response while he was still talking. She told him smaller things at first, about the fabrics she preferred, about a difficult commission from a banker's wife in Tucson that had taught her that some people would never be satisfied no matter what you gave them, about how she preferred the desert in the early morning before the heat arrived, when the light came in low and everything cast long shadows and the colors of the rocks were at their richest. He never asked about her past. The dark shape of it was there, the secrets she carried, the hidden history that had sent Cass Whitmore across a saloon floor with a knife and recognition in his eyes. But Edgar kept his promise to himself and left those questions unasked. He understood that whatever Elvira Callahan had lived through before Copperhead Creek, she had survived it. She was here. She had made herself a life out of skill and independence and iron will, and the hidden motive she might have once had for leaving everything behind was her own business. But the secrets had a way of not staying buried. It was 3 weeks after the Silver Bell, on a Tuesday morning so still and clear it felt like the sky was listening, that Edgar came up the path and found Elvira standing on the porch, not sitting as she usually was, but standing rigid, with a letter in her hand and her face gone to stone. He came up the steps without thinking about it, which he had never done before. He was on the porch before he registered that he had crossed that threshold. "What is it?" he asked. She handed him the letter without a word. It was handwritten on good paper, the hand precise and educated. It was signed with a name that Edgar did not recognize, a man named Royce Harlan. It said, in language that was carefully polite and absolutely menacing beneath the politeness, that Mr. Harlan was aware of Miss Callahan's current location, and that he looked forward to resuming their acquaintance at the earliest opportunity. It said that the unfinished business between them had waited long enough, and that a man of Mr. Harlan's patience was not a man to be tested further. Edgar read it twice. His jaw was very tight by the time he finished. "Who is Royce Harlan?" he asked. Elvira was looking out at the desert. The morning wind was moving through the dry grass at the edge of her property, and she was watching it with a focused emptiness that Edgar recognized as a woman deciding how much to say. "He owned a saloon in Dodge City," she said at last. "4 years ago, I worked there." Edgar waited. He understood that what she was telling him required all her trust, every bit of it, and that any reaction other than careful attention would break something. "I was not a soiled dove," she said, and there was a flatness to her voice that told him she had said that sentence before defensively to people who had already made up their minds. "I kept the books. I managed the inventory. I was good at it." A pause. "Royce Harlan wanted something from me that I would not give. Not my labor, which I had contracted to provide. The other thing. When I refused him, he made my life very difficult. When I still refused him and began looking for a way out, he told me he would ruin my reputation so thoroughly that no legitimate employer west of the Mississippi would touch me." Her voice was perfectly controlled. "He had the connections to do it. He nearly did." Edgar held the letter. He was thinking about Cass Whitmore, about the recognition in his eyes when he had crossed the saloon floor. "Whitmore worked for him," he said. "It was not a question. Whitmore was his man in Tucson," she said. "Royce has been looking for me for 2 years. He wants me back, which is not really about me. It is about control. He does not like to lose at anything." The trap of it was clear to Edgar. A woman with a shadowed past, alone on the edge of a small town, a man with resources and connections and no moral objections to using both in whatever way served him. Elvira had been living under this shadow for years, moving, rebuilding, waiting for the next letter or the next Whitmore to come through a door. This was a woman who had been running a survival operation while also managing to build herself a business and a life, and Edgar felt a ferocious admiration for her that was so strong it nearly undid his composure. "He will come here," Elvira said. Her voice was quiet. "He always comes eventually." "Let him come," said Edgar Fairchild. She looked at him then, really looked at him, in a way she had not done at such close range before, and something in her expression shifted from stone to something more unguarded and more frightened, not of Royce Harlan, but of what she saw in Edgar's face right then. "You cannot protect me from this," she said, and in her voice was the history of every person who had told her that and meant it as an excuse to leave her to it. "I am not offering to protect you," Edgar said. "I have seen you defend yourself. You do not need protection." He set the letter down on the porch railing and looked at her directly. "I am telling you that you are not alone in this. That is different." He left shortly after because he had patrol duties, and because there was a great deal to process, and he was the kind of man who needed to move through hard thoughts rather than sit in them. But before he left he said, "I will be back tomorrow morning," and she said nothing, but she did not tell him not to come. He wrote that evening to the territorial marshal's office in Prescott for information on Royce Harlan, citing the letter as threatening correspondence received by a citizen of Copperhead Creek. He also wrote to the sheriff's office in Dodge City for any records on Harlan's operation there. He did this quietly, without telling Sheriff Pruitt, not because he was hiding it but because he wanted to have the full picture before he brought it to his superior. He told himself this was procedural caution. It was also, in some honest part of him, that he allowed to operate only after dark, a need to be the one who handled this, who stood between Elvira Callahan and the machinery of her dark past. The morning after he had left the letter and made his promise, he came up the path as usual and found the porch empty. He stood at the foot of the steps for a long moment in the pale early light. A hawk was circling over the desert to the north, riding a thermal with that magnificent indifference that birds of prey carried so naturally. He turned to go. "Edgar," her voice came from behind the closed door. He turned back. The door was closed and she was speaking from inside through the wood. The intimacy of that of her voice from behind a door hit him somewhere below the sternum. Yes, he said. There is coffee on, she said. He stood very still. I do not want to impose, he said. I made 2 cups, said Elvira Callahan, and even through the door he heard the trace of something that might, on a woman less armored, have been humor. He went up the steps. He knocked because she had not opened the door, and knocking felt right. Come in, she said, and he did. It was the first time Edgar Fairchild crossed the threshold of the Callahan house, and the interior was exactly what he might have expected if he had let himself imagine it, which he had not allowed himself to do. It was spare but not empty. Everything in it was chosen for a reason. The sewing corner was organized with a precision that spoke of a professional mind. There were books, real books, a full shelf of them, which in 1882 in a frontier town was a statement of commitment. The curtains were simple, but the fabric was beautiful, something she had clearly chosen and made herself. She handed him the coffee at the kitchen table and sat across from him, and they drank it in a silence that was so entirely different from awkwardness that it had its own texture, its own quality of ease. He came back the next morning, and the morning after that. He knocked each time, and she called for him to come in, and they sat at the kitchen table with their coffee and talked or were quiet together. And Edgar Fairchild understood that he was in the most serious trouble of his 31 years of life, because he was falling in love with a woman who lived inside walls built from hard experience, and he was doing it willingly, with his eyes open, which was the only way a man of his nature could have done it. The response from Prescott arrived on a Thursday. It confirmed that Royce Harlan was a known figure in the territory, that he had real estate and business interests in Tucson, Las Vegas, and possibly Albuquerque, and that there had been one complaint of intimidation against him filed by a former employee, which had gone nowhere. The Dodge City response was more informative. Harlan had run a significant operation there, gambling and liquor primarily, and there were rumors of worse, but nothing that had stuck legally. He was wealthy and he was careful, and he was, as Elvira had said, a man who did not like to lose. Edgar brought these letters to Sheriff Prout, along with Harlan's letter to Elvira and his account of the Whitmore incident reframed in this new context. Prout listened carefully, which was one of his better qualities. He agreed that the situation was potentially dangerous. He authorized Edgar to pursue it further and to make official contact with Harlan if and when he arrived in Copperhead Creek. "You are personally involved," Prout said, not quite as a question. Edgar met the older man's eyes. "I am personally motivated to see a citizen of this town protected," he said. Prout looked at him for a long moment. "That is the same thing," he said, without judgment. "Just be sure the personal does not override the professional when the moment comes." Edgar acknowledged this. He carried it with him as a reminder and a warning, because Prout was right. When the forced choice arrived, and Edgar knew it would need to be capable of separating what he wanted as a man from what the law required of him as a deputy. What happened next made that calculation significantly more difficult. It was a Saturday, 5 weeks after the Silver Bell incident, and Edgar had come to the Callahan house later than his usual morning time, because a horse had thrown a shoe on the main street and caused a minor incident. He was later than usual, and when he came up the path he heard voices, 2 of them. One was Elvira's, steady and controlled. The other was a man's, low and deliberate, and carrying the particular quality of someone who was accustomed to being obeyed. Edgar did not knock. He stepped onto the porch and opened the door. Royce Harlan was sitting in the chair across from Elvira at the kitchen table. He was perhaps 45 years old, well-dressed in a charcoal suit that was expensive and entirely out of place on the frontier, with silver at his temples and a face that was handsome in the way of men who knew it and used it. He had a hat on the table and a cup of coffee that he had apparently helped himself to. Elvira was standing, not sitting, which told Edgar she had not offered him a seat or the coffee. Her arms were crossed and her expression was controlled, but her jaw was tight and her eyes went to Edgar with something in them that was not quite relief, but was close to it. Harlan looked at Edgar with the calibrated curiosity of a man assessing a potential obstacle. He took in the badge. He took in Edgar's height and the quality of his stillness. He leaned back slightly in his chair. "Deputy," he said pleasantly, "I was just having a conversation with an old acquaintance." "Miss Callahan," Edgar said. "Are you all right?" "She is perfectly fine," Harlan said before Elvira could answer. "We have a private matter to discuss." "She does not appear to want this conversation," Edgar said. He did not take his eyes off Harlan. "Miss Callahan, would you like this man to leave your property?" A beat of silence in which Harlan's pleasant expression did not change, but his eyes went flat. "I would," said Elvira. Edgar stepped fully into the kitchen. "Mr. Harlan," he said, "this is private property. The owner has asked you to leave. You will do so now." Harlan rose from the chair with a deliberateness that was its own kind of statement, a man who stood up on his own schedule and no one else's. He picked up his hat. "You are making a mistake, Deputy," he said, "getting involved in private affairs that you do not fully understand." "I understand what trespassing looks like," Edgar said. Harlan moved toward the door, pausing when he was level with Edgar, and the two men were close enough that Edgar could see the precision of Harlan's shave, the quality of his cufflinks, the absolute confidence of a man who had never lost. "She is mine," Harlan said quietly, with the certainty of someone stating a fact. "She has always been mine. You are standing in the way of something that will happen regardless of you." "If you come onto this property again without an invitation," Edgar said, at the same volume and quietness, "I will arrest you for trespassing. If you send another letter designed to intimidate, I will arrest you for criminal threatening. If you lay a hand on this woman, the last restraint I have will be used up. That is not a professional statement. That is a personal one." Something shifted in Harlan's face. Not fear. Men like Harlan did not carry fear in places Edgar could see it, but a recalibration, a reassessment of what he was dealing with. Harlan went out the door and down the steps and along the path without hurrying. He mounted a horse that was tied at the far fence post, an expensive animal, a bay that was too fine for frontier roads. He rode back toward town without looking back. Edgar turned to Elvira. She was still standing with her arms crossed, but the controlled stillness had changed. She was shaking very slightly in the hands. He had seen this before in people who had held themselves together through the threat and were coming undone a little in its absence. He knew better than to comment on it. "How did he get in?" Edgar asked. "He walked in," she said. "I was in the garden. He went around back and through the kitchen door." A pause. "I should have kept it locked." "You should be able to leave your own kitchen door unlocked," Edgar said. She uncrossed her arms and set her hands flat on the table, looking at them. "He has been looking for me for 2 years," she said. "I thought when I came here, when I was far enough from Tucson, that I had gone somewhere he would not think to look." Her voice was very even. "I was wrong." "You were not wrong to try," Edgar said. "You were not wrong to run when running was what you needed to do." She looked up at him. "I am tired of running," she said. "Then do not run," he said. "You live here, you have a business here, you have a right to be here." He pulled the chair out from the table and sat down across from her because standing felt wrong, felt like he was preparing to leave and he was not. "Tell me what he wants, the real answer, not the polite one." Elvira sat down. She looked at her hands again for a moment, then raised her eyes to his. "He kept records," she said, "when I worked for him. He kept records on everyone who worked for him, things that could be used. Not all of them were accurate." A pause. "He is not in love with me, if that is what you are wondering. He does not love anything. But I knew too much of his operation and I left on bad terms, and he cannot stand the idea of a woman, specifically me, being free of him and succeeding at something. It is the principle of the thing to him." "What records?" Edgar asked. She met his eyes. "He has documents that suggest I was complicit in certain transactions, moving money, changing inventory books, a beat. I kept his books, Edgar. I changed what he told me to change. I did not know what it meant at the time, and when I understood it, I stopped and I left. But his version of events is different." The hidden motive became clear. Harlan was not just a man nursing an obsession. He had leverage, or believed he did. He could threaten her not just with physical intimidation but with legal exposure, with the kind of scandal that would destroy her business and her life in Copperhead Creek as surely as fire. What transactions? Edgar asked carefully. He was moving money from his gambling operations to avoid taxation, Elvira said. And one other thing, she held his gaze steadily. He was buying stolen cattle, not large quantities, enough to profit, and enough to be a serious crime. Edgar was quiet for a moment. If there are records showing that activity, properly documented with a legitimate witness account, he would rather see me destroyed than prosecuted, she said. The records I kept are my copies. I know the original books are altered, but if I come forward, he will destroy my reputation as a defense strategy, and in a territorial court in 1882. I know, Edgar said. He did know. He was not naive about the law's relationship with women in this era, about how testimony from a woman with a complicated past fared against a wealthy man in an expensive suit. We have to be careful about how this is done. We, she said, not a question. A word she was tasting. We, he said, and there it was. That single syllable containing everything, containing the declaration he had not made in words and the one she had not invited in words, and both of them sitting with the weight of it in the morning light in her kitchen. Neither of them said anything more about it that day. He left when his duties required it. But things had changed between them, and they both knew it, and the knowledge was frightening and entirely, undeniably good. Royce Harlan did not leave Copperhead Creek. He took a room at the Golden Elk Hotel, which was the better of the town's two lodging establishments, and he was polite to everyone he encountered, because men like Harlan always were. He went to the Silver Bell in the evenings and played cards with a skill that suggested he had been doing it professionally for years. He spoke to people, the right people, and Edgar became aware over the following days that Harlan was building something, laying groundwork, making himself a presence in the town before he made his next move. Edgar went to Prout again. Prout was sympathetic but cautious. "We cannot remove him from town without cause," Prout said. "He has not committed a crime here that we can document." The letter was threatening in tone but not explicitly so. The trespass was handled. He rubbed his jaw. "We watch him. We document everything. We wait." Edgar did not like waiting. He was not, at heart, a patient man, though he had trained himself to look like one. But he understood the law's requirements, and he maintained them. What Harlan did, instead of confronting Elvira again directly, was something more calculated. He began talking. Specifically, he began mentioning things in conversation in the Silver Bell. Nothing overt, nothing actionable, just insinuations. He mentioned that he had known a woman in Dodge City once, very capable, very smart, who had unfortunately been involved in some questionable business. He did not name Elvira. He did not have to. In a small town, the direction of a story becomes clear long before the words catch up to it. Edgar heard about this through Horace Dempsey, who was troubled by it. "People are starting to talk," Dempsey told him. "Not badly yet, but that man is planting seeds." The betrayal of it, the insidious patience of it, the way Harlan was willing to pollute a whole community with innuendo to trap a woman who had done nothing but survive him, turned something cold and certain in Edgar's chest. This was the threat Elvira had lived under for years. Not just the physical threat, not just the danger, but this, the slow, corrosive destruction of reputation, of the life she had built, of the safety she had made. He told her. He sat across from her at her kitchen table, where he was now a daily presence in the mornings, and he told her plainly what Harlan was doing. She received it without visible surprise, only with a weariness that was worse than anger. "I know," she said. "Mrs. Hargrove came to cancel her fitting commission yesterday." She did not give a reason, but she did not need to. Edgar's hands were flat on the table. "Give me the records," he said. "Your copies. I want to see them." She looked at him for a long moment. He understood the weight of what she was being asked to do. Those records were her evidence and her vulnerability both, the only weapon she had, and handing them to anyone, even him, was a form of trust that she had built her entire survival strategy around never offering. "Edgar," she said. "I know," he said. "I know what I am asking." Another long moment. Then she rose from the table and went to the back of the house, and he heard the sound of the trunk being opened, the sound of papers being moved. She returned with a cloth-wrapped packet and set it on the table between them. He spent an hour studying those documents. They were meticulous. Elvira Callahan had kept books the way a surgeon operated, with precision and clarity and zero tolerance for ambiguity. There were two sets of records, the originals she had copied before leaving, and her own parallel set that showed the discrepancies between what the book said and what had actually moved through the operation. There were dates, figures, and names, including the names of the ranchers whose cattle Harlan had purchased at below-market prices with no legitimate paperwork. "This is enough," Edgar said. "This is enough to open a federal investigation. If anyone believes a woman who worked in a saloon," she said. "With documentation this complete and verifiable, a federal marshal does not have the luxury of dismissing it on character grounds," Edgar said. "This is not testimony. This is evidence." He looked up from the papers and found her watching him with an expression that he had never seen on her face before. It was open in a way she rarely allowed herself to be open, and it was frightened in a way that had nothing to do with Royce Harlan. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. Her voice was quiet and serious. He met her eyes. There were 100 versions of the answer he could have given, the professional version, the civic duty version, the version that dressed everything in the language of law and justice. He did not give any of those versions. "Because you matter to me," he said. "Because you have mattered to me since October when you raised your coffee cup at a passing rider who did not deserve the acknowledgement, and you gave it anyway. Because I have been walking past this house every morning for months trying to build up enough courage to tell you that, and I do not have more time to waste on cowardice." The silence after that was the loudest silence Edgar Fairchild had ever sat inside of. Elvira looked at the table, then she looked at the window, then she looked at him, and what was on her face then was so unguarded, so raw with the collision of wanting something and being terrified of wanting it, that Edgar barely breathed. "I am complicated," she said. "I noticed," he said. "I come with a man who wants to ruin my life and possibly forge documents to have me imprisoned," she said. "I noticed that too," he said. "Edgar," she said, and his name in her voice was something he felt behind his ribs. "I have not let myself want anything that could be taken away in a long time." "I know," he said. "Neither have I." She looked at him for another moment. Then she reached across the table and put her hand over his, and the touch was careful and deliberate, and said everything the words were too frightened to say yet. And Edgar Fairchild turned his hand over and held hers, and they stayed that way for a long time in the morning light of the kitchen in the house on the eastern edge of Copperhead Creek. The next 2 weeks were a negotiation on multiple fronts, and Edgar ran them simultaneously with a focused energy that surprised even him. On the legal front, he wrote to the federal marshal's office in Prescott with a full account of the Harlan operation, attaching copies of Elvira's documentation. This was not a standard procedure for a county deputy, and he knew it would raise questions, but the territorial cattle theft elements gave him federal jurisdiction grounds, and he made that argument clearly in his letter. He expected to wait weeks for a response. The response came in 9 days, which told him the names in those documents were names that the federal office recognized. Marshal Calvin Riggs arrived in Copperhead Creek on a Thursday morning in late April, on a train from Prescott, and he was not what Edgar expected. He was 50, compact, with the eyes of a man who had spent a long career reading people in tight situations. He met with Edgar and Sheriff Pruitt at the sheriff's office for 2 hours. He studied Elvira's documents. He asked careful, informed questions. At the end of the 2 hours, he said, "I want to speak to Miss Callahan directly." Edgar went with Elvira to that meeting. He did not ask if she wanted him there, and she did not tell him to stay away. They walked to the sheriff's office together, which was itself a statement in a small town, and he was aware of it and did not care. Marshal Riggs spent an hour with Elvira. He was professional and measured and fair, which was not guaranteed but which Edgar had assessed correctly. Elvira answered his questions with the same precision she brought to everything, and when Riggs leaned back at the end of the hour and said, "Miss Callahan, your documentation is among the most complete I have received in a fraud and theft case in 15 years. Edgar saw the particular quality of stillness that came over Elvira when something she had been afraid to hope for turned out to be real. Riggs turned to Edgar. "You understand that my taking jurisdiction in this case will require you to step back from direct involvement." "I understand," Edgar said. "You have done excellent work here, Deputy," Riggs said. "This is a clean, well-built case. I do not want it complicated by personal entanglement in the arrest." "It will not be," Edgar said. Riggs arrested Royce Harlan that afternoon. It was done with a quietness that was almost anticlimactic after everything that had led to it. Riggs walked into the Golden Elk Hotel dining room, where Harlan was having his supper with 2 federal deputies and a warrant, and Royce Harlan was taken into custody and transported on the Friday morning train to Prescott for federal arraignment on charges of tax fraud, cattle theft, and conspiracy, the last arising from his direction of the late Cass Whitmore. Edgar watched the train leave from the platform. He was on duty. He was in his professional capacity entirely, and he stood with his hands clasped behind his back and his badge catching the morning light, and he watched the train until it was a line of smoke over the desert. Then he went to find Elvira. She was in her garden, which she returned to whenever she needed to think or process something, kneeling in the spring dirt with her hands in the soil. She heard him coming and looked up, and in her face was something that was not quite celebration, not quite relief, but something quieter and deeper than either. It was the face of a woman who had carried something heavy for a very long time and had finally been allowed to set it down. He sat on the garden fence rail and looked at her, and she sat back on her heels and looked at him, and the desert was warm around them and the garden smelled of turned earth and something blooming at the edge of the fence. "It is over," she said. "It is over," he agreed. She brushed the dirt from her hands. She was looking at them as she did it, carefully, the way one looks at something familiar seen newly. "I do not know what to do with that," she said. "I have been organized around the threat for so long that I am not sure what I am without it." "You are a dressmaker," he said. "A very good one. You are a gardener. You are a reader of what looks like half the books in Arizona territory. You are the woman who would leave raccoons something better at the edge of the property to keep them out of the main beds." A pause. "You are someone I would very much like to have supper with, not on a professional basis, if you are willing." She looked up from her hands. The sun was warm on her face and in her dark hair, and her eyes were very direct. "Are you asking me to supper, Edgar Fairchild?" "I am asking you to supper, Elvira Callahan," he said. She almost smiled. It was a small, almost smile, the kind that came from someone whose face had forgotten how, and it was the most beautiful thing Edgar had seen in a long time. "I would like that," she said. He came for her at 7 the following Saturday, cleaned up and in his good jacket, and walked her to the hotel dining room, which was the best supper establishment in Copperhead Creek, and they sat across from each other at a table by the window and talked for 3 hours. They talked about things they had not talked about in the kitchen over coffee, bigger things, the shape of their lives, what they wanted from the years ahead, what they believed in. Elvira had opinions about a great many things that she had kept largely to herself, and hearing them fully articulated was like watching someone open a room that had been sealed. He walked her home. At the gate she turned to face him, and the night was warm and full of stars, the desert sky doing what it did best, which was making everything else feel small and significant at the same time. "I liked tonight," she said. "So did I," he said. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she went up on the tips of her boots and pressed her lips briefly to his cheek, and then she was at the door and inside it before he could fully process what had happened, and the door closed softly behind her. Edgar stood at the fence for a moment. He was grinning, which was not something his face did habitually, and the desert was indifferent to it, and he did not care at all. The mornings continued. He came every morning. He knocked. She called for him to come in. He had coffee with her. But now they also had suppers on Saturday evenings and Sunday afternoons when he was off duty, walks along the edge of town where the desert opened up and the light came in long and golden. They were building something together in the careful, deliberate way of two people who had both been bruised by the past and therefore took nothing for granted. He kissed her properly for the first time on a Sunday afternoon in May in her garden, where she had been showing him the progress of the spring planting, and had turned to explain something about the bean plants and found him much closer than she expected. And for a moment they stood in that proximity, and then he put his hand along her jaw and she tipped her face up, and the kiss was gentle and certain and tasted like the future. She pulled back and looked at him, and her eyes were very bright. "I have been waiting for you to do that," she said. "I have been working up to it," he said. "I noticed," she said, a deliberate echo of his own words from weeks ago, and he laughed, which was also not something his face did habitually, and she laughed too, and it was the first time he had heard her laugh fully, without restraint, and it was everything. Summer arrived and deepened, the Arizona heat making everything slow and golden and hazy. Elvira's business expanded. 2 women from the neighboring town of Redrock had heard of her work and commissioned pieces, and she was talking about hiring a girl to help with the simpler sewing. Edgar put in for the deputy position to become permanent with a raise, which Prude approved, partly on merit and partly because Prude had become very fond of Elvira's coffee cake, which she sent occasionally to the sheriff's office via Edgar. The trial of Royce Harlan took place in Prescott in July. Elvira was called as a witness. Edgar accompanied her on the train, which was a 2-day journey, and they stayed in separate hotels, because neither of them had any interest in giving the defense ammunition. Elvira testified for 4 hours, and she was, by the account of Marshal Riggs and the 2 federal attorneys and a journalist from the Prescott newspaper who was covering the case, the most precise and devastating witness anyone had seen in recent memory. She sat in the stand in a dress she had made herself, dark blue, very fine, and answered every question with a clarity and detail that left Harlan's defense with nothing to work with. Royce Harlan was convicted on all charges. He was sentenced to 12 years of federal imprisonment. The judge complimented the prosecution's preparation of the evidence. He did not specifically acknowledge the woman whose meticulous record-keeping had made the case possible, because courts in 1882 did not often do that, but Marshal Riggs shook Elvira's hand on the courthouse steps and said, "Miss Callahan, you should consider a career in law," and she said, with the ghost of her almost smile, "I believe I already had one, Marshal." On the train back to Copperhead Creek, they sat together in the passenger car as the desert turned orange in the evening light, and Elvira leaned her head on Edgar's shoulder, which she had not done before, and he put his arm around her, and they rode in silence back toward their town, toward their ordinary and extraordinary life. He proposed to her in September. He had thought about it for some time, about how to do it, about the words to use, and in the end he did it in her kitchen, which was where all the truest things between them had happened. He came in the morning as he always did, but this time he was carrying something extra, a small ring that had belonged to his mother, a thin gold band with a small garnet setting, which he had written to his sister in Kansas to send him, and which had arrived the previous week in a tiny box packed in cotton. Elvira was at the stove with the coffee when he came in. He set his hat on the table and waited for her to turn around, and when she did she read something in his face immediately, because she was very good at reading him by now, and she set the coffee pot down and looked at him with an expression that was completely still. He did not get down on one knee. It did not occur to him, and later, thinking about it, he realized it was right that he had not, because he was not submitting to her, he was standing level with her, the way he always had. He held out the ring and he said, "Elvira, I would like very much for you to be my wife, if you are willing to be. Not because you need someone to stand between you and the world. You have demonstrated that you can do that yourself, but because I would like to stand with you anyway for the rest of my life if you will have me." Elvira looked at the ring. She looked at his face. And then she said, in the quietest and most certain voice he had ever heard from her, "Yes, Edgar, I will." He put the ring on her finger and she looked at it for a moment. And then she stepped forward and put her arms around him and pressed her face into his neck. And he held her in the kitchen in the morning light, and neither of them said anything else for a long time, and nothing needed to be said. They were married in November, on a day that was clear and cold and brilliant, in the little church with the crooked steeple, with the preacher who drank too much performing a ceremony that was nonetheless heartfelt. Sheriff Prout was there, standing straight-backed and moving his jaw in the way of a man who was not going to allow himself to get emotional. Horace Dempsey and his wife were there. Several of Elvira's customers, women who had become something closer to friends over the year, were there. And from Kansas, arriving on the Wednesday train, was Edgar's sister Clara, who was 23 and sharp-eyed and had taken one look at Elvira and said, "Well, you are exactly right for him," which was the kind of assessment that could only come from someone who had known Edgar Fairchild his whole life. Elvira wore the dress she had been making for the past 6 weeks, ivory cotton with a fitted bodice and small pearl buttons down the back, and she was the most beautiful woman Edgar had ever seen, which he told her afterward, and which she received with the particular expression of someone who believes a thing and is also slightly afraid to believe it, which was characteristic of her, and which he loved. The reception was held at the Silver Bell, which the owner, a man named Burl Tanner, had cleaned and decorated with what might generously be called enthusiasm, and there was music and dancing and an amount of very good whiskey, and Edgar danced with his wife in the middle of the floor of the place where they had, in a sense, truly begun, and held her close. And she put her cheek against his, and they moved through the music together with the ease of people who had learned each other's rhythms over months of mornings and evenings and all the hours between. He moved into the house on the eastern edge of town. His belongings, which were not extensive, arrived in 3 trips. The books were shelved with her books, and they argued companionably about organization by author versus organization by subject, and settled on a hybrid system that satisfied neither of them completely and both of them perfectly. He built a second shelf for the overflow. He fixed the 3rd porch step, which had been warped and loose since she moved in. She rearranged the kitchen to accommodate 2 people's morning routines, and he learned her coffee preference with the dedicated attention of someone who understood that small dailiness was the real architecture of a life. He still went out every morning on patrol. He still came back to the house in the evening. And in the mornings when he left, he kissed her goodbye at the door, and the door was always open when he came home. In January, she told him she was pregnant. He heard the news in the kitchen, where all the best and truest things happened, and something in his face must have done something remarkable because she laughed at him, her full laugh, the one that was still rare enough to be precious. "Edgar," she said, "you are going to be a father. Try not to look like you have just been given an extraordinary piece of news that you do not quite know what to do with." "I am trying," he said. "Give me a moment." He sat down. He sat back up. He crossed to her and put his hands on her face and looked at her with everything he had in him. "A child," he said. "Yes," she said. "Our child," he said. "That is generally how it works," she said, but her eyes were very bright. He kissed her forehead and her cheek and then her mouth, and held her in the kitchen with the morning light coming in through the curtain she had made from her favorite blue cotton, and the desert outside was quiet and wide, and the future was opening in front of them like a map of somewhere they had never been but were entirely ready to go. The pregnancy was healthy. Elvira continued to work throughout it, which surprised no one who knew her. refusing to be treated as an invalid on the grounds that women had been doing this since the beginning of the world, and she had bolts of fabric that were not going to cut themselves. The girl she had hired, a 15-year-old named Me who had a gift for fine work, took on more of the heavy lifting, and the two of them developed a working partnership that Elvira spoke of with the particular warmth she reserved for things she genuinely valued. The months were good. Edgar made a small room at the back of the house into a nursery, sanding the floors and whitewashing the walls himself, building a cradle from pine with a care and attention to detail that told everyone who saw it exactly how he felt about its eventual occupant. Elvira sewed tiny garments with the same precision she applied to everything, small soft things in pale colors, folding them into the cedar chest at the foot of the bed. In September of 1883, their son was born. It was a long labor, and Edgar spent most of it on the porch because Elvira's aunt from Tucson, who had come to help, had told him firmly that his presence inside was not useful and was in fact counterproductive. And Edgar, who could face down men with guns without visible distress, found that he had no counterargument for this woman and retreated to the porch with his hat in his hands and wore a groove in the boards with his walking. The cry came at 4 in the morning, thin and outraged and absolutely alive, and Edgar Fairchild sat down on the porch step and put his head in his hands for just a moment, not in despair but in the overwhelming of everything at once, all the love and terror and gratitude that a man could carry. The aunt appeared at the door. "You can come in now," she said. "You have a son." He went in. Elvira was propped up in the bed, tired in a way that went beyond physical tired in the way of someone who had done an enormous thing and was on the other side of it. And in her arms was their son, small and wrinkled and red-faced and absolutely perfect, waving one fist at the general injustice of the world. Edgar sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his wife and his child, and the room was quiet and warm and the lamp was burning low, and outside the desert was dark and vast and indifferent, and none of that mattered at all because in this room was everything. "He looks annoyed," Edgar said. "He is a Fairchild," Elvira said, and closed her eyes briefly with a smile. They named the boy James after Edgar's father, with Edgar's middle name of Amos as his second. So he was James Amos Fairchild, and he was, from his first hour, a person of enormous opinions. The years that followed were ordinary years and extraordinary ones simultaneously, which is the only way good years come. Edgar was made sheriff when Ward Prout retired in 1885, which brought a modest increase in pay and a significant increase in responsibility, both of which Edgar accepted with the same practical seriousness he brought to everything. He hired a new deputy, a young man named Wesley Cole from New Mexico Territory, who was earnest and somewhat nervous, and who, within his first week, had developed a visible admiration for Elvira's housekeeping and coffee cake that Edgar found both transparent and harmless. James grew. He was a sturdy and energetic child who had his mother's dark hair and his father's gray-green eyes, and a personality that combined Elvira's precision with Edgar's quiet intensity in a mixture that was already, at 3 years old, evident. He followed Edgar on short sections of his morning rounds with the absolute seriousness of a child who understood that what his father did was important, and Edgar explained the work to him in terms a small person could understand, and James listened with the focused attention of a boy who intended to remember everything. In 1886, Elvira discovered she was pregnant again, which she announced to Edgar at the kitchen table with a directness that was characteristic of her, and Edgar received it with the same expression he had worn with the first announcement, which made her laugh in the same way. And he sat down and stood up and came to her and held her face, and she laughed at him for a second time, and it was the same and entirely different and just as good. Their second child was a girl, born in the spring of 1887, and she was named Clara Rosette, for Edgar's sister and for Elvira's mother, a woman Elvira had not seen in 12 years, and whom she wrote a letter to upon the birth of her granddaughter. A letter that took 3 drafts and an evening's worth of quiet tears and Edgar's steady presence at her shoulder, and which she sent and which, 6 weeks later, received a reply that Elvira read twice, and then folded and put in the cedar chest, and did not speak about for a day, and then told Edgar about at the kitchen table with a face that was open and very young-looking, and which held something that was healing. Her mother had written back with love. Copperhead Creek grew. The railroad expanded. The territory was pushing toward statehood. New families arrived and new businesses opened, and the Callahan house, which had once been on the edge of town, found itself slowly being surrounded by town. Edgar and Elvira added rooms over the years: a proper bedroom for James, a small room for Clara, a parlor that was kept for company and which contained the best of the shared book collection, and which smelled always of the dried lavender Elvira hung in bunches from the ceiling, because she had read somewhere that it kept moths away, and she liked the smell besides. The dressmaking business became genuinely significant. By 1888, Elvira was employing 3 women in addition to me, who had grown up and become her senior assistant and confidant, and she had customers in 3 towns. She had a reputation for quality and fairness, and for being someone whose word meant exactly what it said. People did not try to take advantage of her. They seemed to understand, instinctively, that there was a quality of uprightness in her that would make the attempt uncomfortable for them rather than for her. Edgar, as sheriff, became the kind of man that a town tells stories about. Not in the dramatic, mythological way of frontier legend, but in the quieter way of accumulated trust. People brought him their problems before they became crimes. He mediated disputes between neighbors and between businesses. He was fair to everyone, which in 1880s Arizona territory meant he was sometimes deliberately, consciously fair to people the community would not have required him to be fair to. The Apache families on the edge of the territory who came to trade, the Chinese workers who had settled after the railroad work, the Mexican families who had been there before the town existed and who were often treated as newcomers in their own country. He made no speeches about this. He simply behaved as if everyone he dealt with was a person, which was a more radical act than he sometimes understood it to be. On a morning in October of 1889, Edgar woke early, as he always did, and made coffee, and stood in the kitchen doorway watching the sun come up over the mesa. And behind him he heard Elvira's footsteps on the floor, and she came and stood beside him, and he put his arm around her, and they stood together watching the light change. James, who was 7 now, appeared from his room, sleep-rumpled and already alert, and planted himself at the kitchen table demanding breakfast with the confidence of a child who had never had reason to doubt he would receive it. Clara, not quite 2.5, was still asleep, and the house was quiet except for the ordinary sounds of morning, the coffee pot, the wind outside, a horse somewhere in the distance. "Do you know what today is?" Elvira asked. "Thursday," Edgar said. 7 years, she said. He looked at her. It took him a moment, counting back. 7 years since the silver bell, he said. 7 years since you walked me home, she said, and did not ask questions. He turned to face her fully, and she looked up at him with those direct, serious eyes that had been reading him for years and which still, every time he met them, made him feel like a man who had been given something he had done nothing to deserve. "I am glad you stayed," he said. "After Whitmore, I was afraid you would leave." "I thought about it," she said honestly. "I know," he said. "But you came the next morning," she said, "and the morning after that, and I decided to stop leaving." He kissed her in the kitchen, with the morning light coming in and James making a pointed and theatrical noise of disgust at the table, and Elvira laughed against his mouth, and Edgar held on to the moment the way a man holds on to the things that have made him, with both hands and his eyes wide open. Later that morning, he went on his rounds, as he always did, and he came back in the evening to a house where supper was on the table and his children were underfoot, and his wife was in the kitchen where he found her most often, and the door was open, as it always was now, as it had been for years, open to the morning and the evening, and all the ordinary and extraordinary things that moved through a life when a man was lucky enough to stop walking away from the thing he wanted most. He never left her porch without knocking again, and she never again had reason to wonder if he would come back. In 1890, Arizona Territory was building toward statehood, and the town of Copperhead Creek had grown enough to require a second deputy. Edgar hired a woman for the position, which caused a considerable conversation in town. A young woman named Dora Hennessy, who had grown up on a ranch and could ride and shoot and read law better than most of the men who applied. When the town council objected, Edgar sat in that meeting with the same quality of reasonable, immovable calm that he brought to everything, and he explained that competence was the qualification and that Miss Hennessy had it, and that the alternative candidates did not, and that he was the sheriff, and the decision was accordingly his to make. Elvira heard about this from me, who had been in the general store when two council members were discussing it, and she went home and told Edgar, and he shrugged in the way he had of acknowledging things without making them bigger than they needed to be. And she looked at him and said, "You are a good man, Edgar Fairchild." In the direct, unembellished way she said important things, and he said, "You are the reason I am trying harder," which was the most honest thing he had ever said, and which he meant exactly as much as it sounded. That Christmas, Edgar's sister Clara came to visit with her husband, a quiet schoolteacher named Richard, and their two children, and the Fairchild house was loud in a way it did not usually manage, with 4 children between the ages of 2 and 8 constructing an elaborate and largely fictional frontier universe in the back garden, while the adults drank coffee and talked about the future of the territory and what statehood would mean for towns like Copperhead Creek. Elvira's mother had written twice more by now, and there was talk, careful and tentative, of a visit. It had not happened yet, but the door was open in that direction too, in the way that doors tended to open once you stopped being afraid of them. In the spring of 1891, a letter arrived from Prescott that told them Royce Harlan had died in federal prison of a heart condition. Edgar told Elvira over supper after the children were in bed. She sat with it for a moment. "I do not feel what I expected to feel," she said. "What did you expect?" "Something more," she said. "Relief or satisfaction, something large." She turned her coffee cup in her hands. "Instead, I feel nothing in particular. He has had no power over me for years. He was already gone." "That is a good thing," Edgar said. "Yes," she agreed. "It is." She reached across the table and took his hand, and they sat that way for a while in the kitchen in the lamplight, comfortable in the silence, full of their life and their children and the years they had built together out of two people who had not expected to build anything with anyone. Outside, the desert was dark and vast, and the stars were extraordinary, the way they always were in that country, and the lamp on the table cast a warm circle around the two of them. And from somewhere down the hall came the sound of James talking in his sleep in the way he did, whole emphatic sentences from whatever he was dreaming, and Clara's small, steady breathing from her room, and the house was alive with all of it. Edgar and Elvira sat in their kitchen and held hands across the table and were happy, which is not a small or simple thing, and which they both knew was not something that happened to people automatically or easily, but was built, morning by morning and evening by evening, out of trust and courage, and the decision made daily to stay. The next morning Edgar got up with the sun and made the coffee and put on his hat and stepped out onto the porch into the Arizona morning, which was clean and bright and full of the smell of desert sage and the sound of the mockingbird in the cottonwood at the corner of the property. He stood there for a moment, taking it in. Behind him, the door was open. It was always open now. He had stopped counting how many mornings ago. He came back to it every evening, and it was there, that open door, that exact and deliberate invitation from a woman who had spent years keeping everything closed, who had built her life behind locks and careful limits and the very reasonable expectation of loss. He had not knocked on the day she left it open for him the first time. He had stood at the bottom of the porch steps and understood that something enormous was being offered, and he had gone in, and he had never fully come back out. He touched the brim of his hat to the morning desert, which received this acknowledgment with its customary grandeur and indifference. And then he went back inside because his wife was awake and their children would be demanding breakfast and the coffee was ready. And the day was beginning the way the best days began, with the door open and everything worth living for already inside. James Amos Fairchild grew into a young man who was fair-minded and methodical, and who studied law at the Territorial College in Prescott when it opened, because his mother had taught him that documentation was power, and his father had taught him that power was best used in service of the people who had the least of it. Clara Rosette Fairchild grew up with her mother's eye for precision and her father's stillness, and a talent for drawing that surprised everyone, including herself, and which her parents encouraged with the same uncomplicated support they brought to all her choices. Elvira's mother did come to visit in the end. In the summer of 1892, a woman named Rose Callahan arrived on the train from Missouri, older and smaller than Elvira had been picturing, with Elvira's same dark eyes and the same quality of held-back feeling. Edgar met her at the station and brought her to the house, where Elvira was waiting on the porch, and the two women stood facing each other for a moment in the afternoon light. And then Rose Callahan opened her arms and her daughter walked into them, and Edgar went inside to give them the yard and the moment and the years of distance closing between them. He stood at the kitchen window and watched them, his wife and her mother standing in the yard with their arms around each other, and he made the coffee and set out the cups and was very glad that he had once stopped at the foot of a porch step and found the courage, if not yet to knock, then at least to keep coming back. The house on the eastern edge of Copperhead Creek, which was no longer the edge but was still their house, stood in the sun of the Arizona Territory with its porch boards finally all repaired, and its garden in full summer production and its door open to the morning. Inside, the coffee was always on, and Edgar Fairchild always came home,